He smiled the exact moment my pen left the paper, and it took me 3 full seconds to understand why. My name is Lena. I'm 37, an interior designer with my own small studio in Charlotte, and on the afternoon I signed my divorce papers, I believed I was finally closing the door on the worst year of my adult life. My attorney's conference room smelled like burnt coffee and new carpet. Adrian sat across the table in the gray suit he always wore to anything that mattered, calm in the specific way he'd been calm for months, not the calm of someone accepting a loss, I understood later, but the calm of someone who already knows how the story ends. I signed my name on the last page, set down the pen, and looked up to find him smiling. Not warmly. Not with relief, the way I'd almost expected after 11 months of mediation and cold silences and lawyers translating our marriage into billable increments. It was a small, private smile, the kind you give yourself when a plan finally lands, and it stayed on his face for exactly as long as it took me to notice it before he smoothed it away into something more appropriately somber. I didn't understand it yet. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I didn't understand it for almost 3 more weeks. 3 weeks in which I believed, genuinely, that I had walked out of that conference room with my half of everything we'd built over 12 years of marriage. Our accounts had been split down what looked, on paper, like a fair line. I'd kept the house, small as it was after the market correction. I'd kept my studio, my clients, my name. I thought, driving home that afternoon with the windows down for the first time in months, that I had survived something and come out the other side reasonably whole. I want to back up, because you won't understand how badly I misjudged that smile unless you understand what our marriage actually looked like from the inside, not the version we performed at dinner parties, but the real architecture underneath it. Adrian and I met when I was 25, newly out of design school, broke in the specific glamorous way young creative people are broke, more interested in fabric swatches than 401(k)s. He was 28 then, already working as a financial advisor at a regional firm, already fluent in a language of compound interest and diversified portfolios that I found, honestly, a little bit sexy, the competence of it, the sense that here was a man who understood the mechanics of security in a way I never had. I let him handle our money almost from the beginning, not because he demanded it, not at first, but because it felt natural. He was good at it. I wasn't. It seemed like the sensible division of labor in a marriage, the same way I handled the design of our home and he handled the design of our future. I didn't think much about what it meant, over 12 years, that I never once logged into our joint investment account myself. I didn't think much about the fact that every financial decision of any real size, refinancing the house, opening new accounts, restructuring our retirement contributions, happened through conversations where Adrian explained the reasoning and I nodded along, trusting the explanation more than I ever actually verified the numbers behind it. I told myself this was intimacy, not vulnerability. I told myself a lot of things during those 12 years that I've since had to go back and rename. The marriage started fraying about 3 years before the divorce, in ways so gradual I couldn't have marked the exact date it began if you'd asked me at the time. Adrian grew quieter about money in a specific way, not secretive exactly, just less inclined to explain, more inclined to say "I've got it handled" when I asked a question, in a tone that made asking a second time feel unnecessary, almost insulting to his competence. I noticed. I want to be honest that I noticed, because this isn't a story about a woman who had no access to the truth. It's a story about a woman who had access and chose, repeatedly, not to look too closely, because looking closely felt like an accusation I wasn't ready to make against a man I still loved. The affair, when it finally surfaced 18 months before the divorce, wasn't even the thing that broke us first, though it was the thing everyone assumed had. I found messages on his laptop, carelessly left open one night while he showered, the kind of carelessness that later struck me as almost deliberate, as though some part of him wanted to be caught in the smaller betrayal so I'd never think to look for the larger one. A colleague from his firm. 8 months, based on the timestamps. I confronted him that night, and he didn't deny it, which somehow made it worse, the ease with which he admitted it, the absence of the desperate bargaining I'd braced myself for. "I'll end it," he said, sitting on the edge of our bed with his head in his hands, and I remember thinking, even in the wreckage of that moment, that he sounded less devastated than logistically inconvenienced. I filed for divorce 4 months later, not because of the affair alone, though it was the reason I gave everyone who asked. I filed because something in me had finally started asking a question I'd spent years avoiding: what else had he been managing without telling me the whole truth? I didn't know, that first night sitting on our bathroom floor with his laptop still open beside me, how literal that question was about to become. If you've ever discovered one betrayal and sensed, underneath it, the outline of a larger one you weren't ready to look at yet, you already know exactly the particular dread I carried through those first months of separation. We hired lawyers. We entered mediation. Adrian, true to form, handled the financial disclosures himself, presenting spreadsheets and account summaries with the same fluent competence he'd always brought to our money, and I signed off on document after document, trusting the numbers the way I'd trusted them for 12 years, because questioning them felt, even then, like questioning the one part of our life together I'd never learned to question at all. I didn't know it yet, but that trust, automatic, 12 years deep, worn into a groove I couldn't feel myself following, was about to cost me more than the affair ever had. And the smile on his face the moment I signed those papers wasn't relief. It was the sound of a much longer con finally closing. 2 years before the affair surfaced, back when our marriage still looked, from the outside, like something worth envying, Adrian suggested I open a separate personal investment account just for my design business income, something simple, he said, to keep my freelance earnings organized for tax purposes. He'd set it up himself, walked me through the paperwork one evening at our kitchen table, and I signed where he indicated, the way I always did, without reading every line, because reading every line felt like an insult to a man who did this professionally for a living. I want to start there instead of somewhere more dramatic, because I think that account, the one I barely thought about again for 2 years, is where this story actually begins, long before either of us said the word divorce out loud. My design studio had grown steadily during those years. What started as freelance work out of our spare bedroom had become an actual business with actual clients, high-end renovations mostly, kitchens and living rooms for families in Charlotte's wealthier suburbs. By the time the marriage started fraying, I was bringing in close to $90,000 a year on my own, money that I understood, in the vague way you understand things you've never actually verified, was being managed responsibly in that personal account Adrian had set up. I never logged into it myself. I want to be honest about that, because it matters for everything that comes later. I had the login information somewhere, written on an index card in a drawer, I think, or saved in an email I never went back to read, but I never once, in 2 years, sat down and looked at that account directly. Adrian would mention it occasionally, in the same fluent, confident tone he used for everything financial. "Your account's doing well," he'd say, or "I moved some of your funds into something more conservative given the market," and I'd nod, and that would be the entire conversation, a transaction of trust so automatic I never registered it as a transaction at all. The first small crack, if I'm being honest with myself now, came about a year before I found the messages on his laptop. I was doing my own taxes, my accountant had asked for a summary of my business account activity, and I asked Adrian, casually, for the statements. He said he'd pull them together. 3 days passed. Then a week. When I asked again, he said he was swamped at work and would get to it that weekend. The weekend came and went. I asked a third time, more directly, and he handed me a single printed page, a summary rather than an actual statement, numbers typed rather than the official document format I would have expected from any of the accounts I did have direct access to. I looked at that page for a long moment. Something about it didn't sit right, not the numbers themselves, which looked reasonable, but the format, the slight wrongness of it, like a forgery of something I'd never actually seen an original of. I remember the specific sensation of a small, cold thread of doubt threading through my stomach, there and then gone, dismissed almost as quickly as it arrived, because doubting Adrian's competence with money felt, at that point in our marriage, like doubting gravity. I handed my accountant the summary page instead of full statements, and she didn't push back, and the moment passed, filed away under the growing pile of small inconsistencies I was apparently already collecting without calling it collecting. If you've ever felt a small, cold thread of doubt about someone you loved, and talked yourself out of pulling on it because the alternative felt unbearable. You already know exactly the particular self-deception I was practicing that year, without ever admitting to myself that's what it was. There were other signs, scattered across those months, small enough individually that I'd absorbed each one without ever laying them side by side. Adrian started taking calls in his home office with the door closed, something he hadn't done in the earlier years of our marriage. He grew irritated, in a way that felt slightly disproportionate, whenever I asked simple questions about our finances, not angry exactly, just brisk, dismissive, the tone of a man protecting his territory rather than a man patiently explaining something to his wife. Once, late at night, I woke to find him not in bed, and found him instead in his office, laptop open, closing it quickly when I appeared in the doorway, laughing off my question about what he was working on with an explanation about a difficult client that didn't, in retrospect, fully make sense given the hour. I noticed all of it. I want to be completely honest about that, because this isn't a story about a woman who had no access to warning signs. It's a story about a woman who had them, repeatedly, and chose, again and again, not to pull the thread, because pulling it meant risking the entire architecture of a marriage I'd built my adult identity around, the same way Adrian had built his around being the competent one, the one who handled things, the one I never had to worry about. My sister Beth, visiting for a weekend about 8 months before the affair surfaced, asked me once, out of nowhere, whether I actually knew how much money we had. We were sitting on my back porch, wine glasses sweating in the summer heat, and I remember laughing off the question, saying something about how Adrian handled all that, how it wasn't really my area. "Doesn't that ever bother you?" she asked, not knowing. I told her it didn't. I believed, in that moment, that I was telling the truth. It would take me almost 2 more years, and a marriage ending, to understand how much that particular kind of not knowing had actually been costing me the entire time, not just in dollars, though eventually I would learn exactly how many, but in the slow erosion of a version of myself who used to ask more questions before she learned it was easier, in this marriage, not to. I didn't know it yet, but Beth's question on that porch was the first time anyone had said out loud the thing I'd need almost 2 more years, and a stranger's carelessness with a laptop, to finally start asking myself. The affair surfaced on an ordinary Tuesday, and for the first several months afterward, I believed, wrongly, that it was the only thing I needed to understand about my marriage. I found the messages on his laptop, left open one night while he showered, a carelessness that struck me, even at the time, as strange for a man as controlled as Adrian, though I didn't examine that strangeness closely enough until much later. A colleague from his firm, 8 months of exchanges ranging from professional to unmistakably not. I confronted him. He didn't deny it. He said he'd end it, sitting on the edge of our bed with his head in his hands, and something about the specific quality of his composure, not devastated, I noted even in the wreckage of that moment, but logistically inconvenienced, planted a seed I wouldn't fully water for months. We tried counseling, briefly, at my insistence rather than his. 2 sessions in, our therapist asked a question that seemed simple at the time and only later revealed its actual weight. "Lena, when you think about the resources in this marriage, time, money, decision-making, do you feel like they've been distributed fairly?" I remember pausing longer than I expected to before answering. I said something vague about how Adrian handled the financial side because he was better at it, and the therapist nodded, and we moved on to discuss the affair itself, and I didn't think about that question again for weeks. But it stayed somewhere, apparently, filed alongside Beth's question from the summer before, 2 small threads that hadn't yet found each other. I filed for divorce 4 months after finding the messages, once it became clear that ending it had been more promise than practice, that the affair had continued in slower, more careful form beneath a surface of renewed effort I'd wanted, badly, to believe was genuine. The decision itself felt clean, almost relieving, the specific clarity that arrives after months of uncertainty finally resolve into an answer. What didn't feel clean was the mediation process that followed, though it took me months to understand exactly why. Adrian handled our financial disclosures himself, presenting spreadsheets with the fluent, unhurried competence he brought to everything money-related, our joint accounts, our retirement contributions, the equity in our house, all laid out in clean columns that my own lawyer, a capable but overworked woman named Patricia, reviewed alongside me in meetings that rarely lasted more than 40 minutes. I signed off on document after document, the way I'd signed off on financial decisions for 12 years, trusting numbers I didn't independently verify because verifying them had never once, in over a decade, occurred to me as something I was allowed to need. There was a night, about 6 weeks into mediation, when I almost asked Patricia directly whether we should be requesting a forensic accountant, a term I'd heard once, vaguely, in the context of a friend's Messier divorce, filed away without much thought at the time. I had the thought fully formed. I remember sitting in my car outside Patricia's office, phone in hand, drafting a text I never sent, because asking felt, even then, like an accusation I wasn't sure I had the right to make against a man who'd always, at least on paper, seemed so scrupulously organized about our money. I want to stop here for a second. If you've ever sensed that something underneath a painful situation was even worse than the pain you were already sitting with, and chosen not to look closer because you weren't sure you could survive confirming it, you already know exactly the particular paralysis I was carrying through those weeks of mediation. The specific detail that finally cracked something open arrived almost by accident, 3 weeks before the papers were finalized. My business account, the personal one Adrian had set up 2 years earlier, had generated a small piece of mail I actually opened myself, a notice about a required signature update for the account given the change in my marital status. I called the number listed, mostly out of bureaucratic obligation, expecting a brief, routine call. The representative on the line, after verifying my identity, mentioned, almost in passing, that the account's authorized secondary user, Adrian, I assumed, correctly, would also need to update his information given the divorce, and asked whether I wanted to review the account's current standing while we were on the phone. I said yes, mostly out of curiosity, expecting a number close to what Adrian had always vaguely referenced when he mentioned the account was doing well. The number the representative read back to me was less than a third of what it should have been, based on 2 years of my own business income and the modest, steady contributions I'd always assumed were accumulating there. I asked her to repeat it. She did. The number didn't change. I hung up the phone and sat very still in my studio, surrounded by fabric swatches and a half-finished mood board for a client's kitchen renovation, feeling something cold and precise settle into place where confusion should have been. This wasn't a market downturn. This wasn't bad investment timing, the kind of explanation Adrian had always offered, casually, whenever the subject came up. This was a gap too large, too specific, to explain as anything other than money that had gone somewhere he hadn't told me about. I didn't call Patricia immediately. I didn't call Adrian. I sat with that number for the rest of the afternoon, running through 2 years of small, dismissed inconsistencies, the closed office door, the printed summary instead of an official statement, the late-night laptop closed too quickly, and understood, with a clarity that arrived slow and then all at once, that I hadn't simply survived an affair over the last year. I had been quietly, systematically robbed by the same man, likely for far longer than the affair itself had lasted, and I had spent 2 years handing him every opportunity to keep doing it undetected. If you've ever discovered that the thing you thought was the whole betrayal was actually only the visible fraction of it, you already know the particular vertigo of that afternoon in my studio, staring at fabric samples I could no longer really see. I didn't know it yet, but that phone call, 3 weeks before the papers were finalized, was going to change everything about how I approached the rest of this divorce. I wasn't going to sign anything else without understanding exactly where 12 years of money had actually gone. I just didn't yet know how deep I was going to have to dig to find out. By the time I sat down with the full picture, I had a forensic accountant's phone number saved in my contacts, 4 months of quietly gathered documentation, and a specific kind of exhaustion that had nothing to do with sleep, though sleep had grown scarce too. I didn't tell Patricia about the account discrepancy right away. I want to be honest about why. Some part of me needed to understand the shape of what I was dealing with privately, before I handed it to a system, lawyers, mediators, a process that had already, once, moved forward on numbers I'd trusted without verifying, that had proven itself capable of missing something this large. I found the forensic accountant through Beth, actually, the same sister who'd asked me on my back porch, 2 years earlier, whether it bothered me not knowing our finances. When I finally told her what I'd found, she didn't say "I told you so." She just gave me a name. Her name was Carla, brisk and precise in a way that felt, after months of Adrian's practiced fluency, like finally hearing a language spoken correctly. I gave her access to what I could, my own business account statements going back 3 years, the summary page Adrian had once handed me instead of an actual statement, copies of the mediation disclosures he'd prepared. It took her 11 days to call me back with the first piece of what would become a much larger picture. "There's a pattern here," she said, "of transfers moving out of your business account and into an account I can't trace directly to you or to your joint holdings. It's not huge amounts at once, mostly under $10,000 per transfer, which is below the threshold that tends to draw automatic scrutiny. But it's consistent. Monthly, going back at least 2 years." I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment, doing the math I already half suspected. Under 10,000, monthly, for 2 years. The number Carla eventually confirmed, once she'd traced the full pattern back through banking records and a shell of an LLC Adrian had quietly established under a business name close enough to a legitimate consulting entity that it wouldn't draw immediate attention, came to just over $140,000. I didn't cry when she told me the number. I think, by then, I'd moved past the stage where crying felt like the right response. What I felt instead was the same cold, focused clarity I'd felt in my studio weeks earlier, sharpened now into something closer to purpose. I want to stop here for a second, because I think some of you already recognize this particular shift, the moment grief starts converting, almost without your permission, into something more useful. Not less painful. Just more useful. I didn't confront Adrian. Not yet. I understood, by then, with a precision I hadn't had access to a month earlier, that confronting him prematurely, before the papers were finalized, before I had documentation solid enough to hold up against a man whose entire professional identity was built on making numbers look exactly the way he wanted them to look, would only give him time to cover further, to explain further, to talk me out of my own certainty the way he'd talked me out of small doubts for 2 years running. By then I had what amounted to a silent ace, though I didn't call it that at the time, a full accounting from Carla, bank records, LLC filings, and the original summary page Adrian had handed me instead of an official statement, which Carla confirmed had been altered, the numbers on it roughly 40% higher than what the account had actually held at that time. I photographed everything, backed it up in 2 places, and told no one except Beth and, eventually, a new attorney I'd quietly begun consulting alongside Patricia. That was the hardest part of those weeks, honestly, the growing suspicion, confirmed slowly and then completely, that Patricia herself might not have been fully independent in this process. It started small, a strange familiarity in how quickly she'd accepted Adrian's disclosures without pushing for underlying documentation, an odd deference in a meeting where she'd waved off my one hesitant question about requesting a forensic review, saying it wasn't necessary given how organized Adrian's paperwork already was. I didn't have proof of anything more than negligence, not at first. But the pattern of her accepting his numbers at face value, meeting after meeting, sat wrong in a way I filed away and, for the first time in this entire process, didn't dismiss. I slept poorly through most of that stretch. I'd lie awake running the same numbers, the same timeline, the same growing list of small moments, closed doors, printed summaries, late-night laptops, that I now understood as evidence rather than coincidence. My appetite thinned. I'd stand in my kitchen some nights, plate in front of me, unable to make myself eat more than a few bites before setting it aside, my body apparently keeping a ledger my mind had spent 2 years refusing to read. There was a night, close to the point where the papers were nearly ready to be finalized, when I almost called Adrian and told him everything I knew. I had the phone in my hand. I'd rehearsed the first sentence a dozen times, rearranging the words, trying to find a version that wouldn't tip my hand before I was fully ready. And then I thought about what he'd do with that warning, how quickly he'd start covering, explaining, deploying the same fluent competence that had kept me from asking hard questions for 12 years. And I put the phone down instead, and sat with the decision I was actually making, to let him believe, right up until the moment I chose, that he'd gotten away with it completely. If you've ever held a truth that could detonate someone's entire sense of control, and chosen, deliberately, to wait for the exact right moment to use it, you already know the particular discipline that decision requires, and the particular loneliness of carrying it alone until you're ready. I didn't know it yet, but the moment I was waiting for was going to arrive at the exact table where he expected to walk away having won everything. I just needed a few more weeks to make sure that when it did, there would be nothing left for him to talk his way out of. The papers were finalized on a Thursday afternoon in Patricia's conference room, with Adrian across the table in his gray suit, calm in the specific way he'd been calm for months. I signed my name on the last page. I watched him smile, small, private, there and gone in under 3 seconds, and I understood, in that exact moment, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful after months of quiet preparation, that he believed this was over. That he'd managed, once again, to make the numbers look exactly the way he wanted them to look, and that I'd signed off on a settlement built on a fraction of what actually belonged to me, the same way I'd signed off on financial decisions for 12 years without asking the questions I was finally, fully, prepared to ask. I didn't say anything in that room. I want you to understand that this wasn't restraint born of shock, it was the last deliberate move of a plan I'd been building for weeks. I thanked Patricia, shook Adrian's hand with a composure that clearly unsettled him slightly, though he covered it well, and left the building without giving him a single sign of what was coming. 11 days later, I filed a motion with the court to reopen the financial settlement on the grounds of material non-disclosure and fraud, supported by Carla's full forensic accounting, the altered summary page, the LLC filings, and a paper trail Adrian had assumed, correctly for 2 years and incorrectly forever after, that I would never think to look for. I also filed a formal complaint against Patricia with the state bar, alongside documentation of a financial relationship Carla had uncovered late in her investigation, a referral arrangement between Patricia's firm and Adrian's, one that hadn't been disclosed to me at the outset and that explained, with uncomfortable clarity, why my own attorney had never once pushed for the independent review I'd asked about, hesitantly, months earlier. The hearing happened 6 weeks after that. I want to describe it plainly, because I think the plainness is what makes it land. Adrian arrived expecting a routine procedural matter. Based on what his new attorney later admitted in a deposition, he hadn't been told the full scope of what the motion contained, a small mercy his lawyer had apparently decided not to extend him, or an oversight that cost him the composure he'd relied on for the entire divorce. I sat across from him with Carla's full report already entered into evidence, $143,000 traced precisely, month by month, from my business account into an LLC that existed for no purpose other than moving money somewhere I wouldn't think to look. I said very little. I let the documents do the work I'd spent weeks preparing them to do, laid out in careful, undeniable sequence for a judge who reviewed each exhibit with the specific patience of someone who had clearly seen this particular kind of pattern before, in other marriages, other men who'd assumed their wives would never learn to read a balance sheet closely enough to catch them. Adrian's composure held for the first several minutes, the flat, practiced denial I'd expected, a claim that the LLC represented legitimate investment diversification he'd simply neglected to fully explain during mediation. But Carla's report didn't leave much room for that explanation to survive contact with the actual banking records, the transfers timed suspiciously close to periods when he knew I'd be least likely to be checking my own accounts, the altered summary page with numbers inflated just enough to keep me from asking further questions at exactly the moment I might have. Around the 20-minute mark, something in him shifted. Not into remorse, not right away, into something closer to a controlled unraveling, the specific quality of a man watching a story he'd told himself for years finally fail to hold together in a room he couldn't manage his way out of. "I was going to tell you eventually," he said, and it was the first sentence all day that sounded less rehearsed than the rest. "I know how that sounds. I know it doesn't matter now. But I want you to understand it wasn't a plan from the beginning. It became one. That's different, even if it doesn't feel different to you." The judge allowed him to continue, and what followed was closer to a confession than anything I'd expected from a man who'd spent 12 years being fluent in exactly this kind of control. "It started small," he said. "A few thousand I moved into a separate account after a bad month at the firm. I didn't want you to worry, and I told myself I'd move it back before you ever noticed. And then I didn't move it back, because there was another bad month, and another opportunity that seemed smart at the time, and every time I told myself this was the last time, that I'd tell you everything once things stabilized. They never stabilized enough for me to feel safe telling you. And somewhere in there, I stopped thinking of it as something I was hiding from you and started thinking of it as something that was just mine. Separate. A version of security I'd built that didn't depend on the marriage staying intact. I think some part of me always knew this marriage might not last, long before the affair, and I think I was quietly making sure I'd be fine either way, without ever admitting that's what I was doing. He paused, and for a moment the room was very quiet. I'm not going to pretend I feel the shame you probably want me to feel, he said finally, his voice steadier again. I feel caught. That's honest, and it's not the same thing. I built something careful, and I got sloppy near the end, and now I'm sitting here watching it come apart in front of a judge instead of quietly, on my own terms, the way I always assumed it would if it ever came apart at all. I didn't say much in response. I didn't need to. The judge did not find his explanation compelling as a defense, whatever its value as a confession, and ruled to reopen and revise the settlement, awarding me the full traced amount plus additional damages related to the fraudulent disclosure, along with attorney's fees I hadn't even asked for. Patricia's bar complaint proceeded separately, resulting eventually in a formal sanction and the quiet, permanent end of her firm's referral relationship with Adrian's. I left the courthouse that afternoon into ordinary Charlotte sunlight, and I didn't feel triumphant, exactly. I felt something quieter than that, something closer to the specific relief of finally being believed, by a system, by a room full of strangers, after months of being the only person who'd known the full shape of what had happened to her. Adrian's professional reputation didn't survive the year that followed. Word travels fast in financial circles the size of Charlotte's, and clients who'd trusted him for over a decade began quietly moving their accounts elsewhere once the court records became a matter of public record, easily found by anyone doing even minimal due diligence on a financial advisor. His firm let him go 8 months after the hearing, citing irreconcilable conflicts with client trust standards, language careful enough to avoid explicit liability but clear enough that everyone in the industry understood exactly what it meant. I didn't call him after the hearing. I didn't need to. What I needed, I understood by then, was simply to build something of my own that didn't depend on his version of competence at all. I used part of the settlement to expand my studio, hiring my first 2 employees, taking on larger commercial projects I'd never had the capital to pursue while married. Carla, the forensic accountant who'd found the full trail in the first place, became someone I now recommend to any friend going through a complicated separation, a small, specific way of paying forward the clarity she gave me when I needed it most. Beth and I talk more openly now about money than we ever did before, an unspoken correction to years of me deflecting her questions with Adrian handles that. I manage my own finances completely now, with a financial advisor of my own choosing, one who explains every decision in language I actually understand and expects me to ask questions rather than simply nod along. I don't know what became of Patricia's career beyond the sanction. I stopped tracking it once the bar complaint concluded, understanding that continuing to follow it would only keep me tethered to a version of this story I was ready to finish being part of. The last time I saw Adrian was at a mutual friend's gathering neither of us could fully avoid, nearly a year after the hearing. He looked smaller than I remembered, not physically, just diminished somehow. The way people look once the story they'd built about their own competence has stopped being available to them in front of people who know the truth. We spoke for maybe 2 minutes. It was civil. It was not warm. I drove home afterward without any particular weight in my chest, which felt, on its own, like its own kind of ending. I am not the same person who signed a joint account form at a kitchen table 12 years ago without reading every line, trusting a man's fluency more than I trusted my own right to understand my own money. I ask more questions now, in every part of my life, not just the financial ones. It has cost me a little of the ease I used to move through the world with, the specific comfort of letting someone else handle the hard parts. I've decided I can live without that particular kind of ease. I don't know yet exactly what the next chapter of my life looks like, professionally or otherwise. I've stopped needing to know before I'm willing to keep building it anyway. That, more than the settlement, more than the studio's growth, is the part of myself I'm proudest of finding again. The cruelest detail in this story isn't the $143,000. It's the 3 seconds of silence after Lena signed the divorce papers, in which Adrian let himself smile before remembering to look appropriately somber, the small, unguarded proof that everything about the settlement had gone exactly according to a plan she hadn't even known existed. What makes that smile so devastating in hindsight is how ordinary the 12 years before it actually were. Lena wasn't a woman who ignored obvious red flags out of foolishness. She was a woman who built an entire marriage on a division of labor that felt, at every individual moment, reasonable. He was good with money, she wasn't, and trusting him felt like intimacy rather than risk. The story's real insight is that financial abuse rarely announces itself as abuse. It disguises itself as competence, as care, as one partner simply being better at something the other partner has quietly agreed never to learn. Adrian's justification, delivered in that courtroom with startling honesty, reveals something uncomfortable about how these patterns actually begin, not as a calculated con from day one, but as a small act of self-protection during a bad month that never got corrected, because correcting it would have required an honesty he'd never practiced. By the time it became deliberate, the deception had already become load-bearing in his sense of who he was. Patricia's compromised position matters too, and not just as a plot complication. It illustrates a genuine, uncomfortable truth about divorce proceedings. The systems meant to protect a fair outcome aren't automatically neutral, and trusting your own representation without question can be its own form of the exact vulnerability that got you into trouble in the first place. The real turning point of this story isn't the courtroom confession, it's the 11 days Lena waited, silently, after a routine phone call revealed a number that didn't add up, choosing investigation over immediate confrontation. That patience, uncomfortable and lonely as it was, is what turned a suspicion Adrian could have easily talked his way around into a case he couldn't. What lingers after this story isn't really about money, or even about betrayal specifically. It's about the particular danger of mistaking someone's fluency for their honesty, and what it costs a person to finally learn the difference. Which leaves a harder question sitting underneath all of it: how many of us have handed someone control over something essential, not because we verified they deserved it, but simply because they sounded certain enough that questioning them felt unnecessary? I keep coming back to that 3-second smile, the one Lena almost missed, the one that told her everything before she had any proof to back it up. Not because it was dramatic, but because I think most of us have caught a flicker like that at some point in our lives, a tiny inconsistency between what someone says and what crosses their face when they think we're not really looking, and I think most of us have talked ourselves out of what we saw more often than we've trusted it. The signs were there for years before that conference room, the closed office door, the printed summary instead of an actual statement, the late-night laptop closed just a little too fast. None of it was hidden particularly well, in hindsight. It rarely is. If there's one thing worth carrying out of Lena's story, it's that competence and honesty are not the same quality, and loving someone doesn't obligate you to stop verifying the things that actually protect you. Asking to see the numbers yourself isn't distrust. Sometimes it's just self-respect, arriving a little later than you wish it had. Thank you for sitting with Lena's story tonight. I'll see you in the next one.